Scientists are ringing the alarm bell. Boredom is becoming a modern epidemic like never before. Reading books now feels like homework. Writing a letter by hand is agonizingly slow. Listening to a full music album from start to finish? I might as well ask you to watch paint dry. In short, the everyday things we once chose for fun now feel like chores. Researchers have been watching this trend grow steadily for the past 2 decades, and what they found is truly alarming. I'll get back to that in a second. But first, what exactly is boredom? What do we actually mean when we say we're bored? One modern definition describes it as, quote, an adverse state of wanting to, but being unable to, engage in satisfying activities. In other words, the bored person wishes to become engrossed in the satisfying activity, but cannot. Bored people typically blame their environment or situation, but in reality, boringness is not a property of the world out there. It's in our mind. When I was in Tanzania visiting rural tribes, something that stood out to me was that the people there didn't even really know the concept of boredom. The young people went to school and afterwards they spent time hanging outdoors with their friends, singing, dancing, or playing football. They didn't even have money for a proper football, so they would just make one out of weeds or sticks and kick it around. They would do this for hours and hours until it was time to go home and sleep. Their world was far simpler and provided infinitely less opportunity for stimulation than ours, but the concept of boredom as we know it was basically alien to them. So boredom is something that reflects not on the world, but on us. Now, when we think of boredom, the first thing that comes to mind is the emotional aspect, the unpleasantness of it, the restlessness or frustration that we feel. But the cognitive process that gives rise to these negative emotions is attention-based. At its core, boredom is a problem of attention. According to the latest research, boredom occurs when 2 things happen. A, we fail to successfully engage our attention with internal thoughts or external stimuli required for satisfying activity. And at the same time, B, we become aware of this failure. Think of attention like a spotlight in your mind. When it works properly, it focuses on what matters, keeps you engaged, and makes time flow naturally. But when that spotlight flickers or wanders, the brain puts a label on the situation. This isn't working. So you tag the task at hand or the environment as boring. This breakdown of attention that leads to boredom can happen in various ways. Sometimes our attention gets pulled towards distractions we don't even notice, like that barely audible TV in the next room that makes reading feel tedious. Other times we struggle to maintain focus on a task because we're tired, or on the contrary, because we're overstimulated. So boredom is not the world being dull, but more about our attention losing its grip. First, our attention slips and the mind drifts off the book or the pen or whatever else is in front of us. Then we notice we are drifting and have to force ourselves back, which feels like heavy work. Because our attention can't stick, our brain tags the present moment and the task at hand as boring, and time drags on. In the US, there's been large-scale annual surveys of boredom. Researchers asked tens of thousands of young people to indicate the extent of their agreement with one simple statement: I am often bored. These surveys find that after a small dip in boredom between 2008 and 2010, boredom levels have been rising steadily ever since. This increase is around 1.6% annually for both sexes. Studies in China have also found large increases in boredom between 2009 and 2020. To understand the implications of this, it's important to distinguish between 2 types of boredom. On the one hand, you have what psychologists call state boredom. This is basically the condition of being bored at any given moment. So I'm on a 1-hour train ride that I've done 1,000 times already, and I'm bored out of my mind. That's state boredom. Now, as much as it's not the most pleasant thing in the world, state boredom is a natural human condition. I mentioned earlier that children in a country like Tanzania lack the concept of boredom as we understand it, but I don't want to take that comparison too far. The community where I lived was a very simple one, very close to nature, and people's energy was largely directed towards survival. In such an environment, it is quite difficult to be bored, but I'm sure they also felt boredom at times, though they probably express it in different words. In industrialized societies like North America and Europe, some degree of boredom is inevitable. Surveys find that over 90% of the population admits to being bored at times, and I suspect the remaining 10% are either not being very honest to the poll takers or to themselves. The problem is when boredom becomes prolonged and starts to figure prominently in a person's life, when it becomes a core characteristic and dominates their daily routine. It's then called trait boredom or chronic boredom, and it's a sign that something is not going well in the person's life, or to be more precise, in their mind. The research out of the US and China that we discussed, though it didn't approach the problem from this angle, suggests that we are inevitably moving towards this state, where people today, and especially the younger generations like Gen Z, are chronically bored. To be honest, I think it's safe to say many of them have already reached this state. Now the big question is why? What is driving this boredom epidemic? While boredom is a multifactorial phenomenon, there's no doubt that the main factor is the advent of the digital age. The steady rises in boredom we started seeing 15 years ago coincide with the arrival and proliferation of a number of revolutionary digital innovations. The first iPhone was launched in 2007, WhatsApp in 2009, Instagram in 2010, and TikTok in 2016. Researchers have also found a strong correlation between problematic use of these digital technologies and boredom. A large 2023 meta-analysis looked at the combined data from 59 individual studies and found that excessive use of the internet, mobile phones, social media, and online games was strongly linked to boredom. Even among the subset of people who use these technologies in moderation, the more screen time increases, the higher boredom tends to be. It's kind of ironic because these devices are also supposed to make us not ever feel bored. Now, this relationship is weaker than it is amongst people who are addicted to these technologies, but it's still there. There's also been experimental studies that place people in social and other situations where they may or may not use their phone. And these also find that when phones are present, participants report feeling more distracted and bored. So the evidence seems cut and dry. The question is why this relationship exists in the first place. What is it about these digital technologies that drive the rise in boredom? After all, one of the main reasons we use them is to precisely alleviate boredom. So we feel bored and take out our mobile phone to scroll through Instagram or play some Candy Crush to pass the time. But the more we use these technologies, the less bored we should be, right? Well, it doesn't really work that way. In trying to explain this phenomenon, researchers from the University of Toronto have proposed that digital devices increase boredom in at least 4 different ways. First, they divide attention, which as we saw is central to boredom. Now, in discussions about smartphones and attention, there's often a lot of emphasis on notifications. And indeed, an average smartphone user can receive hundreds of these notifications a day. But in reality, the vast majority of interactions with the phone are initiated by the users themselves. One study found that 89% of interactions were user-driven rather than triggered by a notification. It also found that participants interacted with their phones once every 5 minutes. When all is said and done, the average person will pick up their smartphone from 50 to 150 times a day. Every time this happens, attention is disrupted from the task at hand, performance suffers, and the brain is more likely to tag the situation as boring. This is especially the case for tasks that are medium to higher complexity, where you need to focus 100% of your attention. Even having your phone on the desk without even touching it can make a task seem more boring. The temptation to pick up the phone always lingers in the background and divides your attention because the stimulation it offers is so loud and irresistible. Which brings us to the second way digital devices increase boredom. They push up a person's desired level of engagement. Even when people are engaged in activities that were previously satisfying, like reading a book, they can still feel bored if the experience is not sufficiently engaging. This happens because repeated exposure to pleasurable or engaging things desensitizes people to them. We can see this in the very evolution of social media itself. The early versions of social media were text-based. Then this gave way to photos. Photos gave way to videos, and eventually videos gave way to short videos. There's a constant push to shorter and more stimulating content, and traditional forms of leisure cannot compete. Even watching conventional television is no longer engaging enough, which is why so many people look at their phone while watching a movie or another program on TV. Forget about watching TV. Think about having your favorite delicious cheap food, something like pizza or ice cream. When I was growing up, when your parents gave you a treat like this, all you wanted to do was concentrate on your plate and shut out the rest of the world. Now even this isn't enough, and most people feel an irresistible urge to play with their phone while they eat. Related to this, digital devices also raise the opportunity cost of any given activity. Opportunity cost is the hidden price of any choice, the value of the things you forego by doing one thing instead of the next best alternative. For example, if you spend an evening cooking a big meal, the opportunity cost might be the time you could have used to visit a friend, go for a walk, or simply rest. Smartphones put a portable amusement park in our pockets. Never-ending digital entertainment is always a swipe away. Because these options are available 24/7 and usually more stimulating, the quiet alternatives we once enjoyed suddenly look expensive in comparison. Before the arrival of smartphones and other digital devices, the fallback during a dull moment was things like daydreaming, people watching, or just sitting with your own thoughts. These weren't very flashy activities, and they couldn't really compete with reading a novel or writing a letter. The arrival of these devices has permanently changed that calculus. They've created a cognitive tax. Every moment spent reading a book or having a conversation carries the implicit question, what else could I be doing right now? What am I missing out on at this very moment? Lastly, digital devices increase meaningless. Even though they bombard us with information, they actually reduce the sense of meaning in the world. To see why this is so, consider how people used to receive information in the past. This would be through radio, television, newspapers, or books. These were all well-structured, coherent sources of information. There was a beginning, middle, and end, and everything was logically organized. But nowadays, information arrives as an endless, disordered, and chaotic stream of videos, ads, tweets, and what have you. One minute you see a 30-second clip of a skateboarder in Brazil, the next an ad for protein powder, then a breaking headline about a politician you've never heard of, followed by a stranger's rant about airline food. It's total chaos around the clock, and it undermines a person's sense of meaning. Life starts to look meaningless and random, leading to what we call existential boredom, the feeling that nothing adds up, no story matters, and the day is just noise. You scroll, pause, forget, scroll again, and so on without a clear direction, with no beginning or end, feeling totally disconnected and unfulfilled. Chronic boredom is not just unpleasant, but it also has significant implications for a person's health and well-being. It has been consistently linked to depressive symptoms, anxiety, stress, apathy, and lower life satisfaction. In schools, academic boredom correlates with weaker motivation, poorer grades, and reduced effort. But the effects go beyond just mood and learning. Behavioral studies show that boredom can drive unhealthy habits like overeating, excessive snacking, and binge drinking. It can also push people toward risk-taking, aggression, and even deliberate self-harm. Having said that, the greatest consequence of being in a state of chronic boredom is that, well, you're not really living the life you should. As one pair of psychologists wrote, quote, "When bored, we are not authoring our lives. We are not engaged in activity that flows from and gives expression to our abilities and desires." Alternatively, it could be said that when bored, a person is not forming, acting on, and achieving their goals. So a bored person is very unlikely to develop any skill worth keeping, build memories worth living, or at the end of the day feel they actually did something that mattered. A state of chronic boredom will eventually flatten your life into a dull routine. Wake up, scroll, do the bare minimum at school or work, scroll again, and go to sleep with the mobile phone under your pillow. Then wake up the next day and do the same all over again. Compare that with experiences that make us feel alive and expansive, like mastering a difficult skill, climbing a mountain, or finally bringing a creative dream to life. So before I move on to some very simple steps you can take to reverse a state of chronic boredom, I want to add one important caveat. It should not be your goal to eliminate boredom from your life completely, just as it should not be your goal to eliminate other unpleasant emotions like pain or sadness. To start with, eliminating boredom completely is not realistic, but even if you could, you wouldn't want to. Nature gave us the capacity to feel boredom for a reason. It serves an important self-regulatory function. It tells us that our current situation lacks meaning or purpose. This can serve as the impetus to refocus and do something more meaningful, like seek satisfying social interactions, self-reflect, refocus, and set about changing things. When we smother that signal with quick fixes like phones and video games, we rob ourselves of the chance to listen. On the contrary, people who listen to their boredom and adjust their focus accordingly end up not only better off, but actually less bored. So with that out of the way, it's time for me to tell you one of the simplest things you can do to deal with your chronic boredom. Book this weekend as a tech detox. Friday after work or school, power your phone down all the way off and drop it in a drawer. If you find it necessary, warn your friends and loved ones in advance so they don't worry about you. So no social media, no TV, no gaming, nothing. Instead, get outside, walk around and sit under a tree or a park bench. Take a real book or a notebook or a sketch pad, or just sit in silence and do nothing. Cook something from scratch that needs more than 3 ingredients. Write a letter to an old friend. Anything that roots you back in the physical world, where time moves slower and experiences actually sink in. Now, the first day might feel uncomfortable, and you will have a constant temptation to pick up your phone. But if you push through, by day 2, you'll start to feel the payoff and find some enjoyment in the simple things that you previously didn't even notice. Realistically, this weekend detox is just a starting point. From my experience with problem gamers, something closer to 3 weeks is what you need for the withdrawal symptoms of boredom to wear off and normal life to feel engaging again. Now, because 3 weeks isn't practical for most people, start off with a weekend detox. You can then take 1 or 2 days off all digital devices for every week going forward to recalibrate your attention and prevent boredom from creeping back in. To repeat, the point is not to eliminate boredom entirely, but to retrain your attention and give yourself space to listen to what it's telling you. If you take my challenge, you may find yourself not just less bored, but more alive, more focused, and more in control of your life. Now, if you find yourself unable to commit to the detox and you're wondering why it feels so challenging to do this, it likely has something to do with the way scrolling has rewired your brain. So to understand the 4 ways this happens, watch the video on the screen right now, and I'll see you there.